Scottish are Hebrews, or Hebrews, people of Israelite origin, comprise a significant element amongst Scottish people and people of Scottish descent. This is proven. We have proven it. Our organisation, Brit-Am Hebrew Nations, shows that the lost 10 tribes now are to be found mainly amongst Western nations. That is where they are, according to the Bible and according to related sources in rabbinical sources and secular sources, including linguistics, mythology, history, and all kinds of other fields. Every field that is somehow either pertinent to the subject, we have studied it. We have chosen, we have proven how from each of these different separate disciplines, they all produce evidence pointing in the same direction concerning the lost tribes of Israel. And as we said, what we say applies to peoples of Western origin in general. We do not say that everyone there is descended from Israel. We say that is where lost tribes are to be found, and that from amongst them will come those Israelites who will return to Israel. Originally, the 12 tribes of Israel, these 12 tribes of Israel split into two different sections. The majority of them were taken away by the Assyrians. They lost consciousness of their ancestry, and they became lost in tribes of Israel, and eventually they moved to Western Europe. And they moved in different pathways of migration. Some of them were taken directly overseas in ships to Spain, and also further to the north, and even those in Spain later moved into Ireland, into the British Isles, Scandinavia, and others moved overland in waves of migration. They all merged and they all converged in the same regions. And for those who don't know me, my name is Yair Davidiy. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, the capital of the state of Israel, and the future capital of all of the Israelite tribes, and after that of all of the world. All of the world will be ruled from Jerusalem according to the Bible. And we should remember this and take cognizance of it, be aware of it, and support the state of Israel and do what we can according to what God Almighty directs us in the Bible. And the Scots came to Scotland. According to some writers, the name Scot derives from the Scythians, from Scythi, different names meaning Scythian, and the historical justifications for this assumption, and also Asian writers from olden times said the same thing. And so it is feasible, it is acceptable, but even if it is not to be accepted, physically the Scots were connected with the Scythians. The Scythians were also part of the 10 tribes of Israel, and the Scythians became Western nations, moved to the Western and became Western nations. And concerning the Scythians, we are told that, according to Herodotus, they did not eat pork. They did not eat pig. They had an aversion to the swine. Such are the observance of the Scythians with respect to sacrifice. They never used swine for the purpose, nor indeed is it their want to breed them in any part of their country. Herodotus, the Greek Greek historian, volume 3, book 4, 63. And so this is of interest. At all events, the Scottish people became who they were. They were a composite of different races, of different nations, comprised of the Gaels and of the Picts and of other peoples, and later on there were Scandinavian Vikings that settled amongst them, and also people from the Anglo-Saxon areas who moved up and merged with them. There was also a group who gave rise to the Lowlanders. The people of Lowland Scotland, they originally spoke a language similar to that of the Welsh, according to reports, and they intermixed with others from the south, from people who were otherwise known as the Vandals, and they too were very important, and still are very important in Scottish history. And all of these groups, according to our researchers, all of these groups came from Israel. They were descended from Israelites. All Israelites were a predominant element amongst them. And somehow or other, the feeling is that they had a common origin, that they were parts of the same tribal elements reuniting. And even these different groupings were sometimes mixed up with themselves admixtures of different peoples. For instance, the so-called Picts comprise several tribes, and these tribes, apparently some of them were of different origins. One of them had come recently from Europe. They were known in Europe as Agathyrsi. Agathyrsi, who remained in Europe, apart from those who went to Scotland, those who remained in Europe were later known as the Khazars, and they converted to Judaism, and this already shows a proclivity, an inner instinctive identification with ancestral Israelite identity. And so all of these different factors have to be taken into consideration. And the overall impression is that there was an overriding Hebraic element amongst all of the peoples who settled in Scotland. And there were others as well, as we have shown in our writings. We have a book on this, the book The Tribes, which discusses this. Nevertheless, somehow or other, homogeneity of outlook, of character, came to evolve over the whole of Scotland. And in Scotland, they had the idea that they had come from Israel, were descended from Israel, or were associated with Israel, and they believed that they're somehow or other they were part of Israel. Not only that, there were people, especially the Gaels, they were associated with peoples in Ireland. Peoples in Ireland came and settled amongst them. They also moved across the waves and settled in Ulster and other areas. This was before the plantation area time began in the time of James I of Scotland, of Scotland and England. But long before then, there were already movements across the seas of peoples moving back and forth between Scotland and Ireland. And even though the Irish, or the peoples, some of the tribes who were in Ireland were related to those in Scotland, they did eat swan, they did eat pigs. Pigs were very important in Irish culture. Legends and so on recall the existence of pigs and breeding of pigs and the importance of pigs, not only in Irish culture but also amongst the so-called Celtic peoples in general in Western Europe and so on. The breeding of swine, also the preparing of meat for ham and so on, was an important part of the economic existence of their sustenance requirements. And only Scotland seems to have been exceptional in this case. Nevertheless, we find in old Irish sources, as we find in a work about the Jews in the Jews of Ireland, written by Hyman, by someone called Hyman, Jews of Ireland, Lewis Hyman, the Jews of Ireland, and in 1972 he wrote a book concerning the Jews of Ireland, and he said that in very old copies of the Book of Invasions, that is in old Irish sources and other ancient documents, there it says that the Mosaic law was brought into Ireland by the Milesians. The Milesians were the last settlers of Ireland. They're the ones that came last of all, and they comprised within them the ruling elements of Ireland for the next several centuries. The Milesians were the dominant element who came at the last of all into Ireland, and they determined what Ireland would be. And they, according to these sources, brought the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, with them. They kept the Mosaic law, and they also kept the laws of forbidden and unforbidden foods, including a prohibition against eating pork. So they may have done so, and we have other evidence indicates that these people were indeed of Israelite descent. So, but the Israelites had been exiled for going in the ways of the nations around them, for worshipping pagan gods, accepting pagan customs, and so on. And also, and in their places of exile, they continued to do so. They became even worse. They forgot altogether their ancestry, and they picked up even more pagan, non-Israelite accretions and customs and attitudes and so on. And they were altogether non-Israelite in their outlook at this time. But nevertheless, here and there, some remembrance of ancient Jewish or Israelite customs must have remained with them, and this is an indication that it did. And apparently amongst those who settled in Ireland, it did. And so we have a historical background for this, and we have a source Donald A. Mackenzie, Scottish Folk Law and Folk Life, Studies in Race, Culture and Traditions, written in the UK in 1933. And he has a whole article about how in ancient times, not so much ancient times, not only in ancient times, but up until very recently, that is a few centuries ago, a few hundred years ago, in Scotland, on the whole, people did not eat pork, they did not eat pig meat, often they also did not eat eel, and they had their reasons for doing so was because it was forbidden by the law. And indications are that they had kept these practices, from at least part of them had kept these practices, from even before the pre-Christian era. From before becoming Christians, they kept these practices. And if anything, Christianity had mitigated the application of these laws. It had not made them more Hebraic, but it made them less so, as it does in some cases, as we know. And so he brings a whole lot of quotations on this matter. As Donald A. Mackenzie quotes, there were several sources showing that the Asian, or the not so even so Asian, even going back to a couple of centuries ago, not that long ago, even until very recently, relatively recently, there was still remained some type of recollection of the different food taboos that are similar to those of the Jewish people of the Hebrew nations. Mackenzie quotes from Sir Walter Scott, the famous Sir Walter Scott, who wrote a very important romantic books such as Ivanhoe and other works which were quite famous and well known in his time. And he tells us that the Scots never eat pork. He's quoting someone else. He said the Scots never eat pork. Strange that. Some folk think they are sort of Jews. He also says that the Scots, here he's referring by Scots he means lowlanders, to within the last generations dislike swine's flesh as an article of food as much as the Highlanders do at present. So here he's showing that both the lowlanders and the Highlanders, who at times were antagonistic to each other, and in some ways were quite different from each other and even hostile one to another, and I'd like to emphasise the differences that they did have and still do have between one and the other. But even they, also amongst the lowlanders, there was an aversion to eating pork. They did not like to eat pork. They had an instinctive consciousness that the pork was forbidden, and it was forbidden to eat foods that were forbidden by the Bible, that were prohibited by the Bible. And these sources are telling this. He also, Sir Walter Scott also quotes a Gaelic curse. It says against Englishmen, and this curse says 100 curses on the swine eaters. The English people were considered contemptuous because they ate swine. Also, it tells us that James VI of Scotland had become James I of Great Britain and hated pork in all its varieties. So we also had the English Civil War, in the 1639 to 1661. When the Roundheads, the Puritans, fought against the Royalists, the side of the king. The Scots were involved in these wars, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other, but they were an important element. So at one stage, when the Scottish were at war with the Roundheads, there was a song amongst the Roundheads, amongst the English, which said, as quoted, the Jewish Scots are scorned to eat the flesh of swine and brewers' meat, and so on. So the Scots are referred to as Jewish, and it is mentioned that they have an aversion. They scorn to eat swine's flesh, the flesh of pigs. So this proves that this is another indication or another evidence, a witness, as if to say, as to this phenomenon. Mackenzie also quotes from J.C. Dullywell in 1691, who says, why do the Scotchmen hate swine's flesh? They might borrow it from the Jews. And also a certain Captain Burt on duty in Scotland in 1730 wrote, pork is not very common with us, but what we have is good. I've often heard that the Scots will not eat of it. But it is here a general notion that where the chief declares against pork, his followers affect to show the swine the same dislike. In other words, they did have a dislike against swine. It wasn't kept everywhere, but it was kept, it was known about, and it was prevailing, it was prevalent. Mackenzie also refers to a statement that the Scottish had a prejudice against eating eels, which also forbidden according to the Jewish laws, the more Jewish laws by the Mosaic Covenant. Dr. Johnson in 1773 also mentions the vulgar inhabitants of Skye, that is in Scotland. I know not whether of the other islands, not only eels, but pork and bacon in abhorrence. They abhorred eating pig. Also, Reverend L. Grant in 1793 said the deep-rooted prejudice against swine's flesh is now removed. So in his time it was already being moderated. There was always more people eating swine than previously. But it was still remembered that in the past there had been a prejudice, a strong, very deep-rooted prejudice against it. Also, we have John Toland in 1714. John Toland is famous for several reasons. One of his accomplishments was the translation of the books of Josephus into English. John Toland in 1714 said, "You know how a considerable part of the British inhabitants are the undoubted offspring of the Jews, and how many worthy prelates, that is, churchmen of the same stock, not to speak of lords and commoners, may at this time make an illustrious figure amongst us," and so on. He says that a great number of them fled to Scotland, which is the reason so many in that part of the island have a remarkable aversion to pork and back puddings to this day, not to insist on some other resemblances easily observable. So John Toland in 1714 is referring to a tradition that when the English in the 1200s expelled the Jews from England. Before that, there were also persecutions against the Jews leading up to the expulsion. So some type of tradition exists that many of these Jews in England, instead of going overseas when the English kicked them out, or when the English were persecuting them, they went northwards into Scotland. And this is a possibility, but there is no historical records of it apart from these references. So this is a possibility that exists, but we cannot be sure. At all events, even if such was the case, it is not enough. It would not be enough to explain the widespread prejudice or taboo against books. And this prejudice existed. It existed in Scotland, was very strong amongst Scotland, and we have a report that in Ireland, it also had once existed in Ireland. So this may somehow or other be associated. There may have been way back in history a taboo against pork meat and against other foods that are forbidden by the Jewish laws, by the laws of Moses, because originally these people were descended from Israel. And even though they had changed, they had adapted themselves and assimilated into non-Israelite customs, and are continuing to do so today, something remained of their ancestral traditions. And at all events, their ancestry was that of Israel. They do descend from Israelites, as we have shown in our works. And so this is worth considering and worth keeping in mind. Thank you very much. May the Lord God of Israel bless all of you.